Hello, welcome to episode 72 of Yoga Research and Beyond. We have another meta science episode for you. We're talking about the difference between randomized controlled trials, RCTs, feasibility studies, and pilot studies today. I'm your co-host, Ariana, founder of Yoga Research and Beyond, a yoga teacher, strength trainer in New York City, and co-founder of New York Stretch.
Hi, I'm Jules Mitchell, and I do continuing education for yoga teachers. I do like an advanced 300-hour, I do mentoring, and I really focus on research literacy in just about all of my courses. So I'm always happy to be here and talk more research literacy with Ariana.
It's fun. All right. So this paper is an editorial, this is a informative article. It's not a research study. This is a person who feels very strongly about making clear what the difference is between RCTs, pilot studies, and feasibility studies. The title is The Distinction Between Randomized Clinical Trial, RCTs, and Preliminary Feasibility and Pilot Studies, what they are and are not. The author is J. Haxby Abbott. That's published in the Journal of Orthopedic Sports Physical Therapy. It's from 2014. And as I said, he's explaining the difference between these three kinds of studies. He feels that and it's not just him, he feels that they're often misunderstood and misused. Feasibility and pilot studies are both preliminary studies to see if it's going to be possible and executable to do a full RCT. So you'll see feasibility and pilot studies before full-on RCT. Those preliminary studies focus more on practical aspects of whether or not the study can be successful or implemented, such as will the participants stick to the protocol? Will they be able to get enough people to participate? Do the components of the study work together to show any kind of result? And they work more like a test drive than an actual study, actual RCT. And RCTs, they're designed to fully test a treatment or an intervention, and they're comparing it to a control group or to another treatment. And it requires enough participants to see real differences. That's another thing you won't see in the pilot or the feasibility study. And so they're larger, more powerful than pilot or feasibility studies. That's a basic rundown of difference. Nutshell of difference.
I like how he says that it's less important to understand the distinction between feasibility and a pilot. Even though they are different, they're both preliminary. And so under the preliminary is a feasibility and a pilot. But it's not as important to understand that difference because sometimes they get confused and they like collapse them out in the real world. What's most important is to see that they are a different category than the RCTs. And so I really like that he emphasized that. And for two reasons. Well, one reason mainly, I think in this context, because I do teach a lot of research literacy to yoga teachers, and they get really hung up on like the little tiny details of the types of the studies, because there's all kinds of, like there's some general groups, and then there's like really specifics. Like we've looked at one that was a quasi study, and like, what does that mean? And what does this mean? Everybody gets really hung up on that. And it's like, well, it's just like a technical difference, but it still fits into the overall group. And so I think it like loosens up the needing to know everything. As long as you recognize that it's preliminary and not an RCT, that's good enough, right? That you don't need to necessarily know the differences. That said, he does signify the difference. And I think that's important just for your general understanding. Again, not because you have to know exactly which it is, but it's fun to know how it all works. So the feasibility ones are the ones that actually help develop trial interventions. So it's like if we're going to give 30 minutes of yoga or 60 minutes of yoga, like that, like is this feasible? Will they do it? Will they enjoy it? Will people sign up for it? Is it worth offering that? Should we do this style of yoga or should we do this style of yoga? So that's like, is this feasible? So it's all the details of the interventions, and sometimes the outcome measures. Like, is it feasible to collect blood work and get data? Or is it feasible to ask them 30 questionnaires at the end? Or should we just ask them 3? These types of things. Versus a pilot study is like, I love that he actually used this word. It's like a dress rehearsal.
Yeah, I noted that too. I like that.
So then you kind of already know what you want to be doing. You're not trying to develop the intervention plan. You're really like setting it up so that it's like a mini version. You just have fewer people. And so I really like what he said in the beginning. He said, an underpowered study is not always a pilot study, but a pilot study is always underpowered. So sometimes you can have a randomized control trial and have it be underpowered. That's not good. Even though it wasn't meant to be a pilot study, they just didn't get enough people, and that you should be aware of that. It should disclose that. But all pilots are underpowered because you're not going to invest so much money, because this costs money. The more subjects you have in a study, the more people you have on the team collecting data and interpreting data, and the more writers and whatever, especially when it's multidisciplinary, somebody's paying for all of this. So a pilot study is like a little mini version. So I thought that was...
I like that he called it a dress rehearsal also. Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. And I like also that he talked about how they're misunderstood, and misused, because I've definitely done that, where I see a pilot and forget or get confused that this is not meant to show like efficacy, and you're not looking at it. Does the intervention work? It's really does the study work, So I've definitely done that. And I think it's really helpful to have that reminder.
Yeah. I've been part of a RCT that we didn't get enough people for. So then we went back, and it ended up being a pilot study, but we called it a feasibility study. This was years ago. And now I'm like, now that we're talking about this, I'm like, why did they do that? So I think it's not only like, lay people that kind of confuse the terms. I think sometimes they're just thrown into a bucket, and, even researchers just throw these words around a little bit casually than he's advocating for. But yeah. I also like that he talked about like how important it is to, when you're publishing a pilot study, to not talk about it, not write about it as if it was a study. So like, you shouldn't be reporting on results, especially in the abstract. And I see that happen all the time.
All the time.
So I really appreciated that. It should be very clear. This is a pilot study. This is to test if it could work. But so often you'll see that they're actually reporting on results and making conclusions. And it's even worse when it's in the abstract, because people can't even access the whole paper sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's misleading. That it's not really on the reader. It's more on how the information is being presented, which is frustrating.
And journals should be more responsible in that situation. And so should the reviewers, the peer reviewers, and so should the researchers and the authors.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate this editorial. And even though it's like 10 years old,
it's good.
Still relevant. Great.
So, old research is not always bad research. That's another, maybe that's something we'll do on a future episode. I just actually did a social media post about it. If you only look in a 5-year period, you get way different research than if you look at the history, and it doesn't always imply that it's, bad research. I have a couple more things I want to say on this, if that's okay. I think one really cool thing that he also talked about was like, there's almost like a type of research that happens before even the preliminary. And that's like, if you have really no indication at all if an intervention will work or not, you can't really run a feasibility study or a pilot study if there's like really no information at all. And so he says, then we do something else that's called like a phase 1 or a phase 2 type study, which is like a case study. You'll see a case study or even an observational study. You just watch people over time doing yoga and see how they do. And if they improve on their, whatever the outcome measure is. Now we have some indication that this might work. And so now we can set up a preliminary study for an RCT. It's more common in drug trials, but it does, he does mention physical therapy trials in here. And so, other types of interventions. And so you'll see that. I see that a lot in yoga. You'll see some case studies where it's like this person did yoga and this is what we found. And all of that becomes evidence that builds a case for getting a preliminary study funded and eventually an RCT funded. So just because it's a case study doesn't mean it's like a bad study because it's lower on the hierarchy. It's a smaller piece that gets us to a higher standard of evidence, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
they're all important.
I used to dismiss case studies because I did see them as, less important on that hierarchy that you're talking about. But yeah, no, that makes sense.
They're essential to get the funding for the next step. So you're not going to read a case study and make a large sweeping conclusion, but you're going to appreciate that it exists because it's building toward more and more clear evidence.
Very cool. Very cool.
And then the very last thing I wanted to talk about is just the null hypothesis, because I think that's a fun topic, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again in the future because these topics can get overwhelming.
Yeah.
But in this study, on the second page, there's a nice table. And the table really summarizes the difference between them. And under the randomized clinical trials, under the table, it says, what is the objective? And the objective is the null hypothesis that treatment A is not more affected than a comparison in a case of a superiority trial. So then there's more about null hypothesis, but I'm not going to confuse everyone. But I want to highlight it because it's in the table, but he didn't really talk about null hypothesis in the paper very much. So a null hypothesis it feels kind of weird, but it's like you're setting out to test that your intervention is not better than the control or than the comparator. And like it's set up that way statistically when you start looking at the math, but it's also you're literally setting up the study for that. Because if you're trying to set up a study that your intervention, that your hypothesis, your alternative hypothesis is better, it really opens up the door for researcher bias. It's like, you're like, well, I think this is better, so I'm going to set up my study to prove that it's better. Versus like, I think this is better, so I'm going to set up a study to show that the null hypothesis, which is the opposite, that there is no difference between them. And that can help you strengthen the evidence for the alternative hypothesis. So when you, like the whole terminology is that you reject the null. If you have a positive outcome in your study, you reject the null. So what you're basically saying is you're not saying, oh, this outcome is better or this intervention is better. You're saying there's enough evidence that I can entertain the idea or support the idea that the alternative hypothesis is valid and wasn't by chance. So it's weird little language things, like it's almost like you're talking in a double negative, but it does make a difference. And here's just a fun anecdote. Because I was once working on a study that was a yoga intervention for grief, a special population with grief. And the lead investigator, obviously the hypothesis was that yoga would be better than the comparator, which is standard care, which was like general exercise or something. But the yoga group got all of the bells and whistles. They got donated props from a reputable prop company. They got the lovely room with the nice lighting and the this and the that, and the sequences were, well thought out and ran through, and like it was just this whole thing. And then the comparator group, the fact that they needed like TheraBands was like an afterthought. Like the morning of, everyone's running around scrambling like, oh, we needed this. The room was completely barren. There were no props. And I ended up, they didn't have someone to teach it. So I ended up finding a friend to do it last minute. And she was excellent. She was so good. in her cheer and her mannerisms that one of the investigators even came to me and was like, oh, she's really good. I was like disappointed how good she was. So to me, that's like, this is not testing the null hypothesis. This is how researcher bias enters. And this is not an accurate, we're all human. This is how it goes. But this is what I put her in check on that. I was like, hey, this is not how this works. Maybe if we have pretrial registration and a guaranteed publication, we would also have less researcher bias. If you haven't listened to episode 71, go listen to that. But anyway, that's what the null hypothesis is. So it sounds really confusing until you get a little situational anecdote, which is why I wanted to offer that. It's just, we're just really we're not trying to prove that we're right. We're trying to say, does our opinion is it even worth entertaining as a possibility? Because we're really trying to prove that we're not.
Yeah. I think we should do another episode on the null hypothesis.
Sure.
With some examples.
Yeah, maybe we'll find
a
meta science paper on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good topic to unpack more.
Yeah. I agree. Agree.
Because it gets confusing and counterintuitive.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I think that's it for this editorial. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
That's it.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining, and hope you found this insightful and hope it inspires you to look for more research and let it inform your teaching or your practice. And see you next time.
And if you have any papers that you want us to review, send them to us. We're open to it.